And it's a little bit of a heavy topic, honestly.
Oh.
Yeah, we're heading over to Denmark.
Okay.
To talk about some really insightful work by two 11-year-old boys.
11-year-old. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, Kesser and Steen. And they were assigned a school project that, well, it kind of blew up into something a lot bigger.
Interesting. What was the project?
So they were studying a pond. Seems harmless enough, right?
Yeah, sounds like a typical school project.
Right, except this pond was in the middle of a brand new housing development.
Okay. So did they find something unusual?
They did. And I was honestly pretty impressive what these kids picked up on, stuff that you'd think, well, adults would have noticed.
Okay.
But sometimes I guess it takes a fresh perspective.
That's often the case, isn't it? Sometimes we get so used to things we don't see what's right in front of us.
Exactly. And what they found was that this whole idyllic picture of a pond in a new development, well, it wasn't quite as pretty as it looked.
What do you mean?
Well, for starters, they noticed there wasn't much vegetation around the pond.
You mean like trees and bushes?
Exactly. You know how you usually see those green spaces around ponds and lakes?
Yeah, sure.
Well, turns out those plants are actually super important. Like, they act as natural filters.
Oh, right. They help absorb the runoff from rain and stuff, prevent too many nutrients from getting into the water.
Exactly. And without that natural buffer, anything on the ground could basically wash right into the pond.
Yeah, I see where this is going. Not great for water quality.
And get this. They found that the paved surfaces in the development were basically channeling rainwater and whatever it picked up along the way straight into the pond.
So we're talking oil, heavy metals, maybe even fertilizer, all that nasty stuff.
You got it. And not only is that, not good for the environment, it's also a straight-up violation of local regulations.
Wow. So these kids uncovered a legal issue, too.
Yep. And it gets worse, actually, because on top of all that runoff, people living in the development were using chemical fertilizers on their lawns.
Oh, no. Talk about adding fuel to the fire.
Right. And then in the winter, you've got road salt.
Which can seep into the groundwater.
Exactly. It's like this whole chain reaction of bad stuff.
A domino effect.
Yeah, exactly. And here's the thing that really gets me. This pond, it's not just some random body of water.
What do you mean?
Well, it sits above a well.
A well, like a water well.
Yep. And that well supplies drinking water for the entire town.
Oh, wow. So everything that's going into that pond could potentially end up in people's drinking water.
Potentially, yeah. And in Denmark, their water quality is usually so good that they don't even need to treat it. They have this concept, Gren Vaskning. It basically means the liquid in the soil.
Like the groundwater.
Right, but they see it almost like a giant sponge beneath the surface, absorbing everything. So if the pond gets contaminated, that contamination can spread.
Makes sense. And I'm guessing that overflow system they mentioned comes into play here?
You're right on track. Kesser and Steen, they figured out that eventually they'd need a way to deal with excess water in the pond. And that overflow, well, would have to go somewhere.
Into a nearby river, maybe.
Yeah, which then flows into the fjord. And that's where the fishing industry gets involved.
I was wondering when we'd get to that.
They're already struggling as it is, and if the water quality in the fjord gets worse, well, you can imagine the impact.
Yeah, that could be devastating.
Right. And what's amazing to me is that Kesser and Steen, these two 11-year-olds, they connected all these dots. Their conclusion, this land, it's just not right for construction.
It's a pretty bold statement.
I know, but they backed it up with their research.
Yeah.
And, they've actually got people talking, questioning whether this development should have even happened.
That's incredible.
Right. It's like a wake-up call. We often talk about the need for sustainable development, but these kids, they actually showed what can happen when we don't think things through.
Absolutely. It's a story that really resonates, Makes you wonder how many other places might be facing similar problems without even realizing it.
Yeah, it's a bit sobering, to be honest, but also kind of inspiring. Makes you think, what if we all paid a little more attention, like Kesser and Steen?
What if we all took the time to really understand the potential consequences of our actions?
Exactly. So this is just part one of our deep dive into this story.
Oh, there's more to come.
Oh, yeah. We're going to get into the science behind all of this, the potential solutions, and, most importantly, what we can learn from Kesser and Steen's work. We'll be back soon with more.
Looking forward to it.
Me too. And until then, well, let's all try to be a little more observant, right? Like those two amazing kids from Denmark.
Absolutely.
Ever get that feeling? Like you see a shiny new development project, all decked out in eco-friendly this and sustainable that, but something about it just feels off.
Oh, yeah, I know that feeling. It's like they're trying too hard to convince you, you know?
Exactly. Well, today we're going to deep dive into that feeling with some help from this fascinating piece called Greenwashing.
Catchy title.
Right. And it gets even better. Our skeptical guides on this deep dive are these two guys, Kesser and Steen. And they're taking us on a tour of a local project that's raising some serious eyebrows in their community.
So are we talking full-on conspiracy theory here, or is there something more nuanced going on?
I'd say it's more about a pattern they've observed. They're not just pointing fingers at this one project, but suggesting that there's a bigger trend at play.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What kind of pattern are they seeing?
Well, they argue that developers often use all the right green buzzwords early on, especially when they're trying to get approvals from, decision makers who are keen on environmentally friendly stuff.
Ah, so appeal to the eco-conscious crowd to get the project greenlit then. What?
Then as the project progresses, things start to shift. That initial commitment to sustainability seems to fade away, and the final result looks a lot different from what was promised.
It's like that classic bait-and-switch tactic. Promise the world, deliver a parking lot.
Exactly. And Kesser and Steen have a prime example of this in their sites. They break down this first development project, which initially ticked all the boxes for eco-conscious design. Wood cladding, green roofs, solar panels, the whole shebang.
Sounds impressive on paper. What's the catch?
The catch, and this is where the irony kicks in, is that Denmark, where this project is located, doesn't actually have an abundance of high-quality clay for traditional brick and tile.
So what are they replacing those readily available local materials with?
You guessed it. Those imported, potentially less sustainable eco-options we were just talking about.
Wait, so they're importing materials, which adds to the carbon footprint, and calling it green?
Yep, that's the point Kesser and Steen are making. And to make matters worse, the municipality granted the developers a dispensation, allowing them to deviate from that initial eco-friendly plan.
Oh, come on. So it's not even a case of things not going exactly to plan. There's a deliberate shift away from the initial vision.
Right, and that's where the green lashing comes in.
Right.
It's not just about using eco-friendly materials, it's about creating this perception of sustainability that might not have much substance behind it.
I see. So they're using the language of environmentalism to market the project, but not necessarily following through on those promises.
Exactly. And the dispensation process highlights another key issue here.
Yeah.
Even when there are regulations in place, they can be manipulated, and the final result often falls short of what was initially promised.
Makes you wonder how often this happens, doesn't it?
Right. And that brings us to the new development project Kesser and Steen are investigating. They're already skeptical, and for good reason, given what they've seen before.
What's got them raising an eyebrow this time?
Well, this new project is also all about the eco angle. They're pushing wood walls, solar panels, you name it. In fact, they even quote the developers as claiming this project will be more CO2 neutral than the entire Amazon.
Whoa, hold on. More CO2 neutral than the Amazon. That's a bold claim. What are they basing that on? How do you even measure something like that?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Kesser and Steen seem to think it's a classic example of greenwashing hyperbole, using a grandiose claim to mask potential environmental shortcomings.
So they're using the Amazon, this symbol of natural carbon capture, as a benchmark, but without any real evidence to back up their claims.
Exactly. It's all about the marketing, not necessarily the reality.
It's a clever tactic, I'll give them that. Plays on people's emotions and desire for sustainability.
One specific part of this project that stood out to me was this rainwater collection pond they're planning. It's supposed to be high in the hills right behind a daycare center. Sounds idyllic on paper, but...
But in reality...
Yeah, is it even practical? I mean, have they even looked at the site?
Well, that's where Kesser and Steen's on-the-ground investigation gets really interesting. Their video footage of the actual site shows a very hilly landscape, a far cry from the flat pancake the project plan seemed to be based on.
Oh, so someone knew about the terrain. It's almost like the planners were working from a completely different map.
Right. And even the archaeologists' maps, which Kesser and Steen dug up, clearly show these elevation changes. They even describe it as a challenge in their work.
So it's not like this information wasn't available. This raises serious concerns about how thorough those initial environmental impact assessments really were.
It makes you wonder if there are some regulatory loopholes being exploited here.
It definitely seems that way. And this is where it becomes relatable for everyone listening, right? Have you ever seen a project in your own community where the plans seemed completely out of touch with the reality of the site?
All the time. It happens more often than you think.
And that disconnect can have serious consequences, especially when we're talking about environmental impact.
Absolutely. And that's why Kesser and Steen's work is so important. They're not just highlighting one-off instances. They're pointing to a systemic problem.
It's like they're saying, hey, this shifting goalposts approach to green promises could be way more common than we realize.
Exactly. And it's a reminder to be critical consumers of information, especially when it comes to development projects.
Yeah.
Don't just take their word for it. Look beyond the buzzwords, ask tough questions, and demand accountability.
So listeners, next time you see a project boasting about its green credentials, remember Kesser and Steen and ask yourself, are they walking the walk or just talking the talk?
Because it's not just about individual projects, it's about creating truly sustainable communities.
That's something to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the murky and sometimes surprisingly hilly world of greenwashing. Okay, so today we're going deep on Van Hullet.
Van Hullet?
Yeah.
You know,
What is that?
that's
I've never even heard of.
the water hole.
Oh.
Yeah. And this one is a little bit messy.
Okay.
So basically the short version is there's this protected area because it's got a bunch of really rare species there, you know.
Right.
But someone wants to build this like big development right on the edge of it.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. And it's just a big mess.
So how does this even happen? Like, isn't there something in place to protect these areas from, being bulldozed over?
Well, yeah, that's what's so crazy about this whole thing.
Okay.
So Denmark's got this thing called Paragraph 3 of the Nature Protection Law, right?
Right.
And it's basically all about, like, you got to protect these natural habitats, right?
Oh, okay. What's that?
But it also gets kind of vague.
Vague. How?
Like, there's this whole thing about the EU's Habitat Directive, too, and specifically Annex 4.
Annex 4, okay.
Which is basically saying, like, hey, these are some seriously rare and vulnerable critters, right?
You got to be extra careful.
I see.
But like I said, paragraph 3, it's kind of vague, so developers can sometimes find loopholes.
Yeah, I bet.
And like sometimes the local authorities are maybe persuaded, shall we say?
Persuaded to look the other way.
Exactly.
Happens all the time.
Yeah, and so you end up with situations like Van Hullet where they're like, oh yeah, we'll protect it.
Right.
But then they're like, oh, but also we want to build this huge complex right here.
Right on top of it.
Pretty much. And it's like,
It just seems...
well, it just doesn't add up.
No, it doesn't.
And one of the things that's like really nuts about this whole situation is this buffer zone.
A buffer zone? What do you mean?
So around the water hole, right, they're supposed to have this like safe space,
Okay.
where no construction can happen.
Yeah, right.
So the wildlife can, chill out.
Gotcha.
Initially, it was like 18 meters.
Okay, that's pretty good.
Yeah, decent size.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But then all of a sudden, they shrunk it down to 8 meters.
8 meters? What?
Yeah.
How is that even possible?
I know, right? It's
Yeah.
like they just decided those protected species don't need so much space to like, breathe.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's crazy. And like,
That's barely enough room for like a picnic blanket.
yeah, seriously.
So you're telling me they shrunk the protected area just to make more room for this development?
Pretty much.
And the local authorities were okay with that?
Well, like I said, sometimes they could be, persuaded.
Persuaded by, a little
Yeah.
extra incentive.
Yeah, something like that.
This is unbelievable.
And it gets worse.
Oh, there's more.
Oh, yeah. Okay, lay it on me.
So they promised this amazing community center.
Okay.
Huge. It was going to be like 240 square meters.
Wow.
And they were going to sell it to the residents for like 1 krone.
1 krone. That's like, what, $1.50?
Yeah, basically nothing.
That's insane.
Right. Sounds too good to be true.
Oh, yeah.
And guess what?
What?
Gone.
Gone.
Vanished. Poof. Disappeared.
So they just straight up lied to the residents.
Pretty much.
It's like they were dangling this shiny object
Yeah.
to get everyone excited.
Well, yeah, make them think they're getting this great deal.
Exactly. And then once everyone's on board,
They pull the rug out.
yeah, exactly.
Classic bait and switch.
So shady, right?
Yeah.
It's more than shady. It's like,
It's like unethical.
it's totally unethical.
I know. And it makes you wonder, like, were they ever even serious about this community center?
Right.
Yeah.
Was it ever a real possibility or just a marketing ploy?
Yeah, exactly. And, like, what does that say about their commitment to the community,
Right. If they're willing to lie about something like that, what else are they willing to lie about?
Exactly. And speaking of things that don't quite add up,
What now?
let's talk about the number of dwellings they're planning.
Okay.
So first it was going to be 46.
All right.
Then they bumped it up to over 60.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, people were not happy.
I bet.
So they said, okay, we'll scale it back down to 51.
Oh, so they compromised.
Yeah, but here's the thing.
Hit that. Even though there are fewer units now, The overall density of the project is actually higher than the original plan.
Wait, how does that even work?
It's kind of like magic, but not the fun kind.
Okay.
So basically, they're tweaking the size and layout of the units so they can squeeze more people into the same amount of space.
Oh, sneaky.
Yeah, on paper, it looks like they're being all reasonable and compromising.
Right.
But in reality, they're just maximizing their profit.
By cramming as many people as they can onto this tiny piece of land?
Exactly. And guess who might end up paying for part of this density game?
Let me guess, the taxpayers.
Figures.
So yeah, they're bringing in some subsidized housing.
Which means the people who are supposed to benefit from those subsidies
are essentially helping to fund a project that might actually be harming the environment.
This just keeps getting better and better.
It's like a bad dream.
Seriously. So let me get this straight. We've got a shrinking buffer zone threatening rare species.
Yep.
A vanished community center leaving residents high and dry.
And some creative math that seems to prioritize profit over everything else.
You got it.
This is a mess.
Yeah, and it all makes you wonder, like, what are we really doing here? You know?
Yeah, what are our priorities?
Exactly. Are we so obsessed with development that we're willing to sacrifice our environment and our communities?
It's a question we all need to be asking ourselves.
Yeah, and so, like, as you're going about your day, keep an eye out for stuff like this in your own communities.
Right, because it's happening everywhere.
Yeah, and if something doesn't seem right,
speak up.
Yeah, don't be afraid to ask questions and demand answers.
Because these are our communities, too.
And we deserve better than a water hole that leaves everyone high and dry.
Well said.
That's all time we have for today. But keep thinking about these issues, folks. And until next time, happy diving.
Stay curious.